Shabbat Shalom. Rabbis, both literally and figuratively, wear a variety of different kippot. Literally, they have a number of different textured and colored kippot, and each morning I look at one and say, which one should I wear today? Well, what I want to talk about today is more in a metaphorical way, a figurative way, and that's the different hats or roles that are carried out by a typical congregational rabbi. First is the role of priest, leading services, officiating at life cycle events, and cultivating a sense of the religious, the divine, within the synagogue community. A second role is that of pastor, seeking to bring peace and healing to the synagogue, and at times to even the greater community, especially to those that are hurting, maybe ill or in need. A third hat is community leader, serving as a representative of the synagogue in the greater Jewish and non-Jewish and secular communities. Fourth is strategic partner with the board and the lay leadership. And a fifth hat is prophet, following the lead of the biblical prophets, whose role it was to routinely remind the Israelites, Tzedek tirdof, justice you shall pursue. And these varying roles are reflected in the Divrei Torah of rabbis. And today, in response to the continuing adverse impact of the pandemic in our society, I'm going to focus primarily on the roles of prophet and pastor. Much of the disruption, many of the adverse consequences that have resulted from the pandemic, while painful and tragic, were somewhat inevitable, perhaps inescapable. The social distancing and quarantining, the closure of many small businesses resulting in millions of employees losing their jobs and now unsure whether they'll be able to pay their bills. The owners of these small businesses wondering justifiably, am I ever going to be able to reopen? I may have had this business for 20 or 30 years. And the one that grabs me is adult children not being able to visit with their dying parents in nursing homes and in hospitals throughout the country. But there are a number of tragic consequences that have resulted from the pandemic. I'm going to talk about just one today for the sake of time. Unfortunately, there are many more that were in fact clearly avoidable. And my reasons for wanting to focus on this area of those that were avoidable is not to point fingers, it's Shabbos. But first, because what occurred this past week even would never have happened if Jewish law, values, and teachings had been followed. And secondly, the question I always want to ask is, what can we do to help remedy some of these avoidable problems and bring some healing to our community? So the one I'm going to talk about today actually has its proof text, its source, in this week's one of the two Torah portions. It's the one Kiddushin, holiness. And Kiddushin is sometimes even referred to as the holiness code. It starts with love thy neighbor as thyself, the basic tenet of the Jewish faith tradition, our brother and sister Abrahamic traditions, most all faiths. It's to love thy neighbor as thyself. So what I want to talk about today is an area that's near and dear to me and maybe to some of you, is food insecurity. So what happened in our country this past week, the only word I could come up with was a Yiddish word, ashanda. As a direct result of the pandemic, There were pictures of farmers pouring milk into the ground, burying their produce and potatoes, and beef and pork and chicken farmers and producers for the same reasons, because some of these meat rendering and chicken plants had to close down because they hadn't taken care of their employees. They were slaughtering cattle, pigs, chickens, because there was no demand for them. They weren't able to sell them. As I learned from listening to a former Department of Agriculture head, it was more expensive. It was the least expensive way to handle the situation, was just to slaughter them and bury them. What made this wholesale destruction of God's creatures and the produce even more egregious is that at the same time you're watching those pictures, there were pictures of millions of Americans. The number has swelled in this country of those unable to buy food today. And you saw them in the lines hoping that they could get a few cans of processed food. Maybe a can of ravioli or spaghetti. And that's why I call it a shanda. How could we be destroying as a nation fresh food, chicken, meat, and there are millions of people standing in line hoping that the food won't run out before they can get their few cans of food and produce? Again, while there are many legitimate questions to be asked and criticisms to be leveled, I'm going to keep my promise, and instead I want to focus on the Jewish tradition. I keep coming back to our tradition because the more I learn about it, the more moved and touched by the wisdom of our ancestors. Food insecurity over 2,000 years ago was a top priority for our ancestors. And the following laws and teachings that I'm going to list are but a small sampling of those found in our sacred texts. And I'm going to start off with the teaching from Kiddushin. It's the source for all the other ones. We're all pretty familiar with this one. When you reap the harvest of your land, and they were totally dependent now, the farmers, they didn't have grocery stores. They didn't have a good harvest, they didn't eat. The cattle wouldn't eat. When you reap the harvest of your land, no matter how much you may need it, you shall not reap the corners of your field. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, whatever falls down as you're trying to gather everything together. You shall not glean your vineyard, nor gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. If fruit fell from the trees, you let it stay there. Why? Because you shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am your God is how all of these follow in Kiddushin. In other words, we're to emulate the ways of God. God creates these animals, God produces the food, and we're to emulate God's ways. And what does God keep saying in Leviticus? You shall be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. And that's what our tradition taught 2,500 years ago. In Deuteronomy, we are taught, if there's a needy person among you, residing within any of your gates, in the land which God has given you, Israel, you shall not harden your heart, nor should you shut yourself off from the needy, but you shall surely extend your hand unto that person and lend that person enough so that he is not lacking. We learn in the rabbinic tradition, the Talmud, and this one just blew me away, to tell you the truth. This is, again, 2,000 years ago. Each community shall have both a soup kitchen and a charity box for the poor, so that no one shall go hungry. The traveling poor, if you came into a town, you didn't have money, are to be given no less than a loaf of bread. That's if they're just going to go through your community, you give them a loaf of bread to take on their way. If the person stays overnight in your community, that person's to be given enough food for the entire next day. And if that person stays for Shabbos, enough food for 3 meals. In the Middle Ages, it was the synagogue, which was the locus of daily food distribution in the community. It also arranged for lodging for the poor. In the leading set of Midrashim on the book of Psalms, it says, when you asked in the world to come, when you're ready to go into the world to come, Olam Haba, you're going to be asked, what was your work? And if you answer, I fed the hungry, you will be told, you can enter the gate of the Lord because you have fed the hungry and the poor. Maimonides, in addition to all of his other brilliance, wrote one of the main legal codes, the Mishnah Torah. And in it he says, and this is again the last one I'm going to give, but there are many more. If a stranger approaches you and says, I am hungry, please give me food, you are not allowed to check to see if the person really needs the food. If they're honest, you must immediately give him what he asked for. No, it was not a perfect culture by far. Slavery, patriarchy, but in many ways, a 2,500-year-old culture was far more humane, far more just and egalitarian than ours today, which is so much more affluent, sophisticated, and educated. So I said that, so the first reason I raised this was so we could see what our tradition, had we been following Jewish law, that never would have happened. We won't have millions of people in food lines hoping to get a few cans of food. The second reason is because we as Jews have an obligation not to sit back and watch, but what can we do to alleviate some of this? And as I said, food insecurity has always been an important issue to me. It started when I was a civil rights lawyer in the South, and I have incredible memories of this. Many of my clients were very poor. And they'd say, how much do I owe you? And I would say, whatever you can afford. And they would bring me corn and tomatoes from their gardens because they had no money. What I soon came to realize is that that little bit of produce that they gave me was far more valuable to them and to me than any cash retainers I ever received from my more affluent clients. Because for some of these poorer clients, they were totally dependent on their garden and their Social Security. Many of them didn't even get Social Security because they were maids and yardmen. And down south, they didn't take out Social Security for their maids. So these people got all they had was what they had, their garden, and they would can and put in bottles whatever they had left over for the winter. So when they gave me something, that was something they couldn't have for themselves and their families for the winters. And if the insects or rabbits got into their garden and ate or destroyed their crops, they had a pretty rough winter ahead of them. It's the reason that I found the opportunity to join the board of Lazarus House, a homeless shelter, a food pantry, so attractive. And right now, Lazarus House is in need of food because it's feeding close to 1,000 families. In our neighboring town of Lawrence, I know Karen knows of other organizations in the same boat that the need has just grown exponentially since the pandemic. So I recently went to our board of directors and I asked if we could start a COVID-19 tzedakah fund here at the synagogue so that our members could make donations and we could decide what are the best organizations, which are the most needy organizations to do that. So that no adult, just like in our Jewish tradition, no adult, no child in the greater Andover area, whether it's Lawrence, we can feel we've done our part to make sure that no one goes without food. We have a wonderful board, and the board came back very quickly and said to me, yes, We think it's a wonderful idea. We want to support it 100%. So that this coming week, Amy will be sending a letter out from the board and myself announcing the existence of the fund and setting some of how it's going to work, what the parameters will be. So I encourage anybody who's able and willing. Why? I know some of you are going to give on your own, but I think it's important for us as a community. If we want to give on our own, that's wonderful. But to also be part of this holy community and say, let the world know that this is Congregation Beth Israel that cares about not only itself and its own community, but for the greater community. I think that's what God wants for us. Another area that I was going to talk about today, because it also just found avoidable, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to allude to it, is the treatment of the elderly in our society. Right away, we knew who were the most susceptible people to getting COVID-19 were the elderly. So how do we explain in this country that the epicenter of COVID-19 deaths in many states are where? At the nursing homes. Even in Massachusetts, I think it's the VA, 60 deaths, some astronomical number. And again, I wish I had time to go through the Jewish teachings on how we treat the elderly, because it would never happen if those teachings had been followed. And so many of the elderly today, the older, are isolating themselves, even more so than the rest. And so again, as a segue, tomorrow morning, one of the reasons I selected it as a topic, I'm going to be conducting a Zoom class at 10:15 on visiting the sick, how we visit the people in our community. But today, visiting the sick is a far more, Bikor Cholim, is far more expansive. It not only includes those who are ill, but those who may be homebound, infirm, whatever the need may be, just a phone call, a Zoom communication, and hopefully before too much more time goes by, personal visits. So I want to close with one more teaching from our sacred tradition. It's from the Talmud, again, 2,000 years ago. And it's a story told of Benjamin HaTzadik, Benjamin the Righteous. And he was the supervisor of the tzedakah and charity fund in a particular community, and also the food pantry. Food was scarce at the time, and a woman came to see him and said, "Rabbi, please give me some money so I can buy food for my family." And he replied, "I am so sorry. There have been so many people in need of food that I gave away all the money from the charity fund this week." And she responded, "If you do not provide me with the money so my 7 children and I can eat, where will we go?" And Rabbi Benjamin HaTzadik said, "You're right." And he reached in his pocket and provided them with enough money for them to eat for the next week, until the charity fund had been replenished. Shabbat Shalom. Just again, I like to point out the beauty of our tradition, teachings, the values. As I have been doing, I'm going to close with a quick prayer. It's a poem, really, by an Israeli poet, Emmanuel Adu. And it's entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be a Jew?" It's to open eyes when others close them. It's to hear others when others do not wish to listen. It's to look when others turn away. It is to seek to understand when others give up. It's to rouse oneself when others accept the status quo. It is to continue the struggle even when one is not the strongest, to cry out when others stay silent. To be a Jew, it is that. It is the first of all, and further to live when others are dead, and to remember when others have forgotten. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May Adonai bless all of us. Jeff, would you? Thank you, Jeff. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May Adonai bless us and keep us, our loved ones. Ya'ir Adonai panav alecha v'hunecha. May Adonai cause God's Spirit to shine upon us. Be gracious unto us, and may we always be a reflection of God's love and graciousness. Yisa Adonai panav alecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May Adonai turn God's Spirit unto us, granting us peace. Amen. Turn to page 183.